trapped alone at the bottom of the sea for 60 hours in total darkness, with cold water slowly rising and no one knowing you are still alive. One man, one small air pocket, and a courage that defies all logic. This isn't a movie. This actually happened. May 26, 2013. The tugboat AHT Jascon 4 was sailing in the Atlantic, about 30 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria, at a depth of 30 meters below the surface. Harrison Okene, 29 years old, was the cook on that ship. In the early hours, around 4:30 a.m., he woke up and went to the toilet. That was it. A trip to the bathroom, the most ordinary decision someone could make, which, without him knowing, had just saved his life. Minutes later, the ship was struck by a sudden and violent swell. Within seconds, the Jascon 4 capsized and sank straight to the ocean floor. 12 people were on board. 11 of them stood no chance. Harrison was trapped inside the hull of the sinking ship in pitch blackness, with freezing water rushing in from every direction. He ran, crashing into walls, banging on doors, trying to find an exit that didn't exist. The water kept rising, cold, dark, and getting tighter. Then he found a small room, the fire equipment locker, which somehow still held a pocket of air at the top. The room was no bigger than a small bathroom, but there was air there, enough to breathe. Harrison climbed up and pressed his face against the ceiling of the room, and he began to wait. What followed were 60 hours that are almost unimaginable to the human mind. The water around him was about 10 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill an adult through hypothermia in a matter of hours, if the body is fully submerged. Harrison stood with water up to his chest, shivering uncontrollably, using scraps of clothing he could find to wrap his body. The darkness around him wasn't just ordinary darkness. At a depth of 30 meters, not a single photon of light can enter. Whether your eyes are open or closed makes no difference. It's the kind of darkness that starts talking to you after a few hours, that starts making your brain create shapes and sounds that aren't there. Outside those thin steel walls, Harrison could hear something more terrifying than the silence. The sound of fish. Sounds that became increasingly clear, indicating that the bodies of his colleagues were nearby and sea creatures were arriving. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. There was only a bottle of Coca-Cola he found floating nearby, which he sipped slowly to stave off dehydration. The only thing he did was pray. In interviews afterward, Harrison said that his wife, Rescue, had accidentally sent him a text message containing a psalm before the ship sank. He didn't have time to read it, but in that darkness, in the piercing cold, he repeated the words of the prayers he still remembered, murmuring his wife's name, pleading for one more chance to come home. Meanwhile, on the surface, everyone had given up. The shipping company sent a team of divers not to search for survivors, but to recover bodies and salvage valuable equipment inside the ship. No one thought anyone could still be alive after more than 2 days at the bottom of the sea, the third day. Divers from the company DCN Diving began to descend into the dark and cramped wreckage, moving cautiously through corridors that had become a labyrinth of rusting iron. One of the divers, Andrew Draper, traced a hallway toward the equipment locker. His hand touched something warm, something that moved. In the helmet camera footage, which later became one of the most viral videos in internet history, you can see the exact moment Harrison emerged from the darkness. A hand reaching out, a trembling body, eyes wide open in the glare of the diver's flashlight. Draper, who had spent years diving and recovering dozens of bodies, could hardly contain himself. He immediately shouted into the radio. Harrison cried inside his helmet. Draper hugged him under the water. But the journey wasn't over. Because Harrison had been at that depth's pressure for 60 hours, bringing him straight to the surface would have killed him. The nitrogen bubbles in his blood would have exploded like a shaken bottle of soda. He had to undergo 60 hours of decompression in a special pressure chamber before he could finally breathe free air. 60 hours to sink, 60 hours to be rescued, and another 60 hours to truly return to the world. When Harrison finally stepped out of the decompression chamber and breathed free air for the first time, the first thing he did was cry and call his wife's name. There is one thing Harrison said in his interview that you can't get out of your mind. He said that time in there felt surreal. He didn't know if it had been 1 hour or 1 week. That darkness erased all sense of time. There were only two choices: keep breathing or don't. And that is what he chose, to keep breathing. We often think of courage as something heroic and grand, actions seen by the world, recorded in history. But Harrison Okene's story teaches us that there is a form of courage far quieter than that. The courage to keep holding on when there is no rational reason to believe you will be enough, when the dark has lasted too long, when the cold has gone too deep, when all the voices around you only remind you that you might already be gone. But he kept standing, pressing his face to that ceiling, and he kept breathing. Sometimes that is enough.